Good afternoon and welcome to Integrity in Journalism during an election year. We are so glad you could join us for this special event as part of Belmont University's Ideas of America programming to support the presidential debate, which was held on our campus last Thursday. Before we go any further, let me take a moment and thank our debate sponsors, particularly HCA Healthcare, the City of Nashville, the Nashville Convention and Visitors Corporation, and Ryman Hospitality Properties. We are so grateful to them and the many other sponsors you'll find on our BelmontDebate2020.com website for making events like this possible. We appreciate you joining us today to hear from John Lansing, President and CEO of National Public Radio. I am Boyd Smith, Director of the Edward C. Kennedy Center for Business Ethics, one of the centers of excellence in the Jack C. Massey College of Business. We are proud to present today's program along with the student chapter of the Center for Public Trust. We welcome Mr. John Lansing, who is joining us from his Washington, D.C. office. John began his journalism career at 17 years old as a studio technician, which eventually led to his 20-year tenure with Knoxville-based Scripps Networks and with the role of president. He next served as CEO of the U.S. Agency for Global Media, which includes Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio Free Asia, among a number of others. John joined NPR in September 2019 as president and CEO. John is joined today by Dr. Sarah Fisher Gardial, Dean of the Massey College of Business. Dean Gardial will engage with John in a fireside chat format to discuss important and relevant issues surrounding integrity and journalism during an election year. Dean Gardial, I will now turn the program over to you.
Thank you so much, Boyd, and thank you for the good work that you're doing as the director of the Kennedy Center here. John, welcome. So good to have you with us.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gardial. It's great to be here.
You know, as we sit here exactly 1 week away from Election Day and think back on how long this election seems to have been going on, certainly this year we're talking about, but even before that, I recollect that Donald Trump actually signed up for his election committee the day after he was inaugurated in 2016. So in some ways, it feels like we've been running an election for 4 years now. I will tell you that I've never, in my history of presidential elections, heard as much conversation about the media and about journalism and how the election is being covered. And so that's what we're here to explore today. And we're very excited about your insights around journalistic integrity and how that's playing out in front of us right now. But let's just start with a basic definition to get us all on the same footing here. When we're talking about journalistic integrity, but certainly in the context of an election year, what are we talking about?
Well, I think, first of all, it begins with intent. What is the intention of the journalism being produced? Is it intended to inform and enlighten and contextualize important information for the American public? Or is there a secondary or a primary intent to confuse, disrupt, or even produce disinformation that really can spoil the public domain of information? But the characteristics that help support the intent begin with independence. As with NPR journalists are independent. They're independent from any outside influence. They're independent from my influence as CEO. And there's a firewall between the CEO and the people that run the news department so that they know that their independence allows them to seek the truth and tell the truth and to do it contextually and to do it with rigor. And part of that rigor is having a multi-layered, strong editing process that checks and double checks to make sure the facts that have been gathered are true and that they are given a fair weighting in the storytelling, no matter who it may affect positively or negatively. But we're seeing a spread of, and we'll talk about more of this later in this conversation, but there's been really an expansion of disinformation and misinformation and terms being thrown around like fake news and press is the enemy of the people. Well, that kind of information, particularly coming out of the highest office in our country, is dangerous. It's dangerous to journalists. It's dangerous to our democratic ideals and our systems and what holds up our democracy. And so it's never been more important that true, down the middle, fair, unbiased journalism is available to the American people.
So as you say, there's been a narrative and certainly some cynicism about the integrity of the press, and that implies that there may be some perceptions in the country now and even around the world that journalistic integrity is somehow on the decline, or that there's an issue with it. Actually, before we go a little bit further down this path, I'd like to take a poll. We've got quite a few people that are online with us right now, and I'd like to ask the audience to register your opinion. Do you believe that journalistic integrity is the same, better, or worse than it was 10 years ago? If you would register your perceptions about that, we'll use that as the basis of moving forward. I'm assuming everyone's used to Zoom and the voting mechanism here. Okay, wow. I guess in some ways I'm not surprised, but that's quite a, I don't know, maybe a depressing response if you look from the point of view of the press and their need to be trusted, when we've got 75% of the respondents that are online right now saying that they believe that journalistic integrity is worse. So John, I'd like for you to follow up on that. And are there examples in your mind about how journalistic integrity may be declining or getting better in recent years?
Well, first of all, I think we have to be clear that journalism and media is not one single noun. It's a collection of hundreds, and when you count blogs and social media, thousands of people seeking to push information for whatever their purpose is. As I said earlier, legitimate news organizations like the Wall Street Journal or the New York Times, their news pages are dedicated to truth telling. Their editorial pages have a point of view, but there's a wall between the editorial page and the news page. But we've all seen the spectrum of political storytelling on cable news, and it runs from left to right, right? It's MSNBC has a left-leaning bias, and Fox News certainly has a right-leaning bias, and CNN, I think, moves probably more to the left than to the right. And that's unfortunate. And when you add to the fact that cable news is on 24/7 and has to fill that time constantly, I can see why it would cause people to wonder what's going on. You know, you have the same story that's being reported in completely different ways by different news organizations that again, that their intent is to create a narrative, not necessarily to seek and report the truth. And so it's confusing. And then when you have people holding high office who question journalists just generally when a story comes out that may be true, but it just is something that's uncomfortable, and then lashes out at journalists and journalism, saying that journalists are the enemy of the people because a story came out that caused discomfort. Then you add all of that together, and then there's social media.
Right.
And social media, where you have Facebook and Twitter and et cetera, who they don't consider themselves publishers. So they take no responsibility for what content is on their platform, or little responsibility, I should say. And that creates an atmosphere for disinformation and misinformation where, frankly, maybe among some audience members, they get the majority of their information from social media or from one network and only one.
Mhm.
So I think you have to really break it down to understand why people feel like the integrity has gone down. But I think you also have to turn it around and say, you look at the reporting of NPR, of the Wall Street Journal, the Times, the Post. This is, high quality news and information based on fact finding, based on rigor and editorial decision making, based on our willingness to be transparent if we get something wrong, because we're not perfect, but our willingness to be transparent about that and correct the record when necessary. All of those things allow people, I think, to understand there's such a thing as integrity in journalism. But to some extent, and this is a little controversial, but I'll say it, to some extent, it's the responsibility of the citizens to weed through what's real and what's right and what's not. It doesn't take a lot of effort to do that, or read or consume a variety of different media so that you understand what biases may be being pushed by either one side or the other, and become a smarter consumer of journalism. I think there's a responsibility on that side as well.
And I think there is some research to underscore the problem that you're speaking about, that people do find themselves in a bit of a bubble in terms of the media that they are accessing. And so you don't necessarily see people reading or consuming journalism and media widely across different outlets. And there's also, there are age differences as well. We know, for instance, that younger audiences are much more likely to use social media as a source of information than not. So, those kinds of things certainly exacerbate the problem. I want to ask you, as we're kind of talking about how things are changing, we're in a much more diverse world now than we were as a country. Certainly when I started out voting. What is the role of journalistic integrity when it comes to addressing the needs of a much more diverse society?
Yeah, that's a great and important question. I'm glad you raised it. At the beginning of this year, back in January, I identified diversity as our #1 priority at NPR. And by diversity, I mean the diversity of our audience. But to get to that diversity, we need to improve the diversity of our staff, the diversity of our leadership, the diversity of our sourcing, the diversity of the voices that people hear on our air. And it's become, for us, our #1 mantra in building our 3-year strategic plan from 2021 to 2024. Diversity is the centerpiece. And the reason for that is that, frankly, we've always been a diverse country. We're just now reckoning with the fact that persons of color have not been heard, have been discriminated against, and the news media has as much responsibility as anyone for anything lacking in terms of covering those communities fairly and raising those voices so that they can be heard, and making sure they are a full participant in our democracy. And we're going to be working extra hard at doing that over the next 3 years, as we have been over the last few years as well.
So to kind of summarize this particular section, which is a little bit definitional, do you have just 3 or 4 points that you would like to make about the state of integrity in journalism? What would your address be to the country?
Well, I think I'd go back to the #1 point, I think, is the responsibility of the news consumer to work hard to get to sources of news and information that are fair and based on a honest attempt to inform the American public with context and transparency. That's #1. #2 is I think we should hold social media platforms accountable as publishers so that they have more of an interest in policing what finds its way in terms of rumors and mistruths and outright lies on those platforms that just completely disrupt the American dialogue, particularly during an important election. And then third, I think we should elevate our work as journalists and understand that we have a responsibility to the American people We have a responsibility to fulfill our constitutional privilege to do the best work we possibly can. And I think if those three things happen, we'd see a marked improvement in the integrity of journalism overall.
All right. I want to add another layer to this conversation by really going a little bit more deeply into the relationship between journalism and society, and bring in the cause-effect conversation that's going on right now about the divisiveness and the polarization that exists in our country, and certainly some would say globally right now. There are a couple of lines of thought around that, and one is that journalism and potentially lack of journalistic integrity has actually fueled some of the divisiveness that's going on, and in that perspective, the journalists are actually responsible for some of the divisiveness that we see. The other perspective would be that the divisiveness exists, and the journalists are simply a reflection of that divisiveness and not necessarily a cause. I'd like to talk about that a little bit more, but again, I'd like to dip into a poll here and ask those in our audience how they feel about that. So which way do you believe that the cause and effect flows in the relationship between media reporting and specifically the divisiveness that we're all feeling in society right now? Do you believe that media is more of a cause of that divisiveness, or that media simply reflects society division? Okay, it's pretty close here. 47% believe that the media is simply reflecting divisiveness, while 53%, a slight majority, feel like that the media has some causal influence there. I'd love to hear your perspective on this, John.
Well, I understand why it's so close, because the answer is both. And it depends on the media. Once again, let's step back, that the media is not a singular noun. There's not a conference call every morning where all of media gets together and says, who are we going to get today? And so that's kind of like, I think in some people's minds, the media is one thing, and it just isn't. In fact, we're actually competitors. And it's in our interest to have the story right, because ultimately our ability to be trusted is the value that we bring to what we do. But there are media outlets whose sole intent is to disrupt and cause disruption. I don't consider that legitimate journalism. It's media, but it's not journalism. And so that's why I would say the answer is both. But if you think of the original concept of what journalism is here to do, it's here to seek the truth, tell the truth, have rigorous controls over having the truth told, and build trust among the media or that news organization and the American people, or whomever their audience is. That's what we do. NPR has no interest in any narrative other than the truth. And I think that's what's missing right now in America. It's almost as though there's a war on truth going on in various parts, not just in the media, but in politics and politicians and office holders. And that's a dangerous thing, because once the truth becomes something that can't be counted on, once true facts are turned on their head and told, and the audience is told that they're not true, or that the media is fake, or that journalists are the enemy of the people, all that is meant to do is to disrupt people's ability to trust in what they need to trust in order to have a functioning democracy. And I think it's a really critical time in our country's history that we establish that everybody has a right to their opinion, but there has to be a single set of unequivocal empirical facts. And when you hear people or media or people in power turn facts into fiction, then you have to ask yourself, are they doing that in service to you, or are they doing it to cause you to not trust anything? And I think they win if the audience doesn't trust anything. So our work has never been more important. I mean, and you could argue it's a life and death situation now because we have a pandemic and there's misinformation and disinformation that could literally cost people their lives.
Mhm.
And so we're working overtime with our member stations, and our great NPR station there in Nashville does a great job to make sure we're getting it right, getting the information to the people, and make sure if something is said on our air that is not true, that we point it out and correct it as soon as possible, because the person we may be interviewing on our air may have a point of view that is not rooted in telling the truth.
You spent some of your career abroad, and so you've got even a wider perspective to bring to this topic than just the United States. And this whole issue of using the media as a political tool, or of undermining the legitimacy of the media, is not just a US problem right now, is it?
Well, unfortunately, we're drifting towards what is happening in other places like Russia and China and Iran and other spheres of influence, where in those countries, the media is controlled 100% by the authoritarian regime, the unelected authoritarian regime, by the way. And so people have no opportunity to hear unbiased, truthful, trustworthy information. And so in my work with USAGM, we would use networks like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe to reach out and inform those audiences so that they could hear the truth from us. And we were reaching 350 million unduplicated listeners, readers, viewers a week. And our research told us that it was so valuable that they had a resource where they know they could trust the information. But here's the way it goes down in Russia. The Kremlin will dispute anything and everything as being wrong. The idea that anything is truthful, particularly something that goes against the regime, is immediately turned on its head. Now, why do they do that? They do that to keep people confused and off balance so that their agenda can get what it needs in order to do what they need to do or want to do without the support of the citizens of that country. So watch what's happening today in the United States. You're seeing a similar attack on truthful, trustworthy information. And what's the purpose of attacking a journalist or a news organization if they're trying to tell the truth? Why would one do that? And I think as citizens of this country, we should ask that question and understand that if somebody's against hearing the truth because it's uncomfortable for them in their authority position, then we should understand that and make sure that the American people understand that. And that's exactly what legitimate, bona fide news organizations like NPR and others exist.
So you mentioned earlier about the different media sources being competitors with each other. And I think one of the things that we need to talk about is this idea of a 24/7 business cycle where the news is always on, and this idea that you're competing with each other for hearts and minds and eyeballs in many ways. And so there's always this need to have the breaking news, the breaking story out there as a way to keep your audience engaged and connected to your organization. Do you think there's been a tension around media outlets need to be out there with a story that is engaging and breaking and tantalizing to people, versus the kind of journalism that you're talking about, which is more careful and intentional and making sure that you're getting directly to the source of the story and double checking facts and those kinds of things?
Yeah, I think you see mostly that through 24/7 cable television news, because they have to fill all that time and they're competing with one another. And so invariably at the top of the hour, a new show comes on and the banner below the anchor says breaking news, breaking news, breaking news. So it is, I think it dilutes the integrity of that network, I think. And I think it underestimates the intelligence of the American audience. And it's true also in local television news, where I was for several years, and was guilty myself at times of chasing breaking news because we knew it was a way to get people to tune in or stay tuned in. And it can cause you to drift away from your core purpose as a journalist, your core mission, which is to give people the understanding they need so that they can improve their world. The breaking news may not have anything to do with anybody but two people in a conflict with one another, and the rest of the audience is having to watch that, waiting to find out why that matters to them. So my experience is that there's two ends of the spectrum. There's crazy breaking news that people will kind of tune into the same way we all slow down when you pass a crash on the highway.
Mhm.
It's just basic human curiosity. That's one end of the spectrum. And the other end is news that's explanatory, that's informative, that helps people improve their lives or stay safe, as with during a coronavirus. And that kind of storytelling requires reporting and editing and as I said, rigor around fact finding. That is really what our purpose is as journalists.
How do we, as consumers, think about media outlets that have a specific political bias or political agenda, however you want to say that? You mentioned earlier the right-leaning obvious agenda of a Fox News versus a more left-leaning MSNBC. As a consumer, and we're using and partaking of those particular outlets, are there ethical issues around that and how they present themselves? How should we be viewing that kind of content?
With skepticism, because what is really happening there? Are they seeking and telling the truth, or are they seeking to support a political agenda? And if the answer is B, the political agenda, then by definition, you're not getting all the facts that you need to make an informed decision. So, I think one of the biggest problems that we've noticed is that people get into a bubble of listening to opinions and stories that they already agree with. And they would, spend all day with one network or another. And over time, they have, a narrative that network wants them to have that may or may not represent what's actually happening. And so that's, again, there's a responsibility on the audience, I think, to branch out and reach out. Why not read both the Wall Street Journal editorial page and the New York Times editorial page once in a while and compare and contrast what they're saying about tax policy or what candidates they're supporting and why. Broaden out your mind. You've never had more opportunity to hear more and different perspectives as an audience. Take advantage of that and hold us accountable to truth telling.
So let's talk about that accountability. Are there, in fact, codes of ethics that are used? How does an outlet such as NPR really make sure that this independence that you're talking about and the firewalls between the managers and the organization and the journalists, how does that play out, and how do we try to assure the truthfulness and the veracity of the stories that are coming out of the media?
Sure. So within our newsroom, we have a standards and practices editor who's available to help the newsroom solve difficult questions related to ethical concerns. An ethical concern might be something along the lines of, do you identify the name of a minor who's the victim of a terrible crime? Yes or no.
Mm-hmm.
They're not always easy, and it requires a thoughtfulness and somebody who's practiced and as a leader in helping journalists think through their responsibility as journalists and weighing its impact on others who have a direct relationship with the story being told, and whether we're creating harm in our truth telling in such a way that we could mitigate that by taking a different approach to the story without having to cause harm to somebody involved in the story. And then at NPR, we have what's called a public editor. And the public editor reports to me. And her job is to represent our audience with our newsroom. And she holds our newsroom accountable to basic standards of high quality and excellence in journalism. And she publishes a column about once a month, holding NPR accountable to our excellence and our standards and our code of conduct, which we have, and does so publicly. She also takes on board emails from audience members who have questions, concerns, or complaints, and we answer every one of them. So we feel very accountable to our audience, through our public editor, and our newsroom is staffed in such a way that we can tackle tough, challenging ethical dilemmas in a way that weighs the truth-telling with the negative impact on those involved in the story and finds a way to tell the story but minimize the harm.
And again, can we bring this specifically to the election, and can you provide any examples of you know, some of the tough calls that have had to be made during this election year?
Well, this has been such a unique election year because we've been obviously hampered in our travel to cover not just the candidates, but to cover the voters. It's you know, it's one thing to be interviewing somebody in Western Wisconsin that's a farmer who voted for Obama in 2008 and voted for Trump in 2016 and understand why. It's one thing to do that and be there and then be in the community in Wisconsin and gathering more facts and more perspective versus doing a phone call or even a Zoom call like we're doing right now. And so that's hampered us, and I'm very proud of our newsroom and how they've pushed through. We've gotten out on the road more recently as the candidates have. And I think we're working very hard to make sure that we're covering the issues and not just the horse race, and that we're explaining the issues and that we're understanding where voters are coming from and not stereotyping one voter to another based on their preference in the presidential election. I think respecting the audience and respecting the subjects of the news, of the stories we cover on the politics side is really what sets us apart.
Do you think that journalistic integrity or lack of it can actually swing an election? Is this, how founded should this fear be in terms of this or upcoming elections, that we really have a system that is fraught with some challenges, as you say, an industry, if you will, and that it really could have an adverse effect on us as a society if we don't get this right?
Oh, and no doubt. I mean, it's not just journalists and journalism and media, it's office holders and office seekers as well. You know, again, calling press the enemy of the people, taking factual information and calling it fake because it's uncomfortable, causing a basic distrust of anything that an individual has identified as being something that is harmful to their agenda. And then media outlets that support that can just create a really a vast sense of upheaval in the absence of having truth and perspective and respect for the idea that the reason the First Amendment exists, the reason journalism exists, is to help people make good decisions about their democracy and about their leadership and about maintaining the integrity of our very set of our systems that support our country. So yeah, I think the amount of disruption going on right now through social media, through Russian interference, through Chinese interference, through Iranian interference, using robots to flood social media with rumors and lies that affect one campaign negatively and support another campaign positively. Those are real. And it's on us as journalists, certainly, to stand tall and work as hard as we can to keep the focus on the truth. But again, I think it's also on audiences, young and old, to understand that there are many, many interests that are trying to manipulate your understanding of what's real. And they have not necessarily any interest in having you understand the truth.
So when you have the leader of a country, ours or another, who literally has the bully pulpit and is using that pulpit to attack various media outlets, how does an organization like yours push back? How can you start reversing those negative perceptions that are being laid out there?
Well, one thing that I'm really proud of what we do, and something other media outlets are doing as well, but that is having us cover the media itself as a beat. Our David Folkenflik covers the media for us, and it allows him to do explainer pieces on this very question, on what media is doing or not doing, and holding media accountable generally, including us, by the way. Our media editor also holds us accountable in his reporting, as he should. And I think more coverage of the media would really be helpful. Years ago, it was a little uncomfortable for the media to have a reporter whose beat was the media, because it felt like maybe it was going against the unspoken pact to not attack one another. But the media has become such an integral part of our country moving in a positive direction, and with so many avenues for misinformation and disinformation and manipulation, I think it's really critical that the media aggressively covers the media in our case, on our air and on our digital platforms.
All right, I have some submitted questions, and I'd like to read these to you and see what your response is. This is from George here in Nashville. In a time that the major news outlets in print, media, and social platforms have become polarized and partisan, what is your advice to help readers and viewers of news programs find unbiased news sources? You said that this is a responsibility that we have. So how do we go about discerning the kinds of sources and coming to the right conclusions about this?
Well, George, it's an excellent question, and it really is along the theme of many of our Q&As this afternoon. But we're in this together. We exist to inform the American public, and our only motivation is to build trustworthiness with the American public. And we believe the trustworthiness that we have is based on our hard work and making sure that we're not operating in support of any political agenda or any agenda whatsoever. That it's the only agenda is to seek the truth, report the truth, and be as transparent and rigorous as possible. So it's a partnership between media and our audiences and our readers, that they also show some rigor in what they choose to consume, what effort they're putting into understanding what's behind the media that they're consuming. And if the answer is an agenda, I guess just understand that, and that's fine, but also understand you're not getting a complete story.
Are there any organizations that rate the media, in essence, on the bias and those kinds of things? You talked about the media reporting on themselves in a sense, but is there any such thing as an independent organization like a Consumer Reports or something like that that could do some of this work for us?
Yeah, there are research companies that do this work. There are, as I said, the reporting by the media. There are trade associations that support excellence in journalism. There's the award system that rewards excellence in journalism, like the Pulitzers or the Edward R. Murrow Awards, et cetera. So collectively, I think there's a support system for high quality journalism. And I think it's important to point out that there are great journalism schools all over this country. Your School of Communications has a journalism program, and great professors that are supporting this work around the country. And that's also a part of it in training up and coming journalists in the fast moving and volatile environment they'll be entering as professionals. So it's a good fight. We're in the fight. We're fighting to do the right thing. We're not perfect. If I've sounded like we're perfect, I don't mean to. Nobody is. And if we make a mistake, I can tell you we correct it, and we do it, publicly. But that would be my response for George.
You touched on this topic a little bit earlier, but I'm going to go ahead and read the question because it's a little bit deeper. Harold in Brentwood says, a classic ethical dilemma has been balancing an individual's right to privacy with the need for the people to know the truth. As it relates to personal lives of high-profile politicians today, where do you draw the line between these two fundamental ethical values?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely a great question. Well, first of all, anybody in public life that chooses to be a politician has a different standard for privacy than a private citizen. They've accepted that. And that's just the way the law works. But that doesn't mean that it's open season. I think we have to weigh the importance and value of the information with the privacy concerns for anyone, but certainly somebody who's running for high office or is in high office and has done something or said something or believes something that is antithetical to what his office stands for, what his oath stands for, his or her oath, then I think it's fair to point out those inconsistencies.
One of the things that happens with politicians who've been serving for long periods of time, let's just say, is that sometimes their position can change over time. How do you deal with the inconsistency with a previous position that a politician might take versus something where they've legitimately had a change of heart or mind on it?
Yeah, I mean, somebody who's been a politician and in office for decades, it'd be shocking to think they've never changed their mind about anything. That would be more shocking to me. I think what journalists would look for, though, is clarity and honesty and consistency, and make sure they're not just blowing with the wind in order to win another election.
Okay. So Kathleen in Nashville wants to know, what do you think is the best advice to give a young journalist on how to self-assess their ability to stay unbiased when reporting on an election?
Kathleen, thank you for that. This will sound a little counterintuitive, but my advice for a young journalist regarding their bias is to recognize that all journalists have a bias. Every human being has a bias. Every human being has a set of circumstances they've grown up with. And I think admitting that to yourself and recognizing it is a step closer to mitigating that bias from getting into your work. I think the idea that a journalist is completely objective is a fantasy. Nobody's completely objective. A journalist's role, though, and their purpose is to seek objectivity, to minimize bias, and understand themselves and their biases enough to know when it's creeping in.
Wow. And maybe have people that will hold you accountable to that bias as well.
Yes.
Right? Surrounding yourself with people that will call you on that if needed. I know that we do, unconscious bias training. And part of that, as you say, is to start with the awareness that there is bias and to put that right out there on the table before you start making decisions or commenting.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And young journalists that are moving into the professional realm are much more challenging than when I was a young journalist, for sure. There weren't cable networks then, there weren't social media networks. There were just the broadcast networks, and it just was a simpler time. And now you have journalists coming into into the profession who have to navigate all of the disinformation and misinformation from both media organizations and politicians in order to, find the shred of what is right, and to make sure that their reporting is filtering for making sure that they can verify what they know to be true through double sourcing or multiple sourcing, and that their sources are not biased themselves in such a way that they be manipulating the reporter or the young journalist. So it's a challenging time, but we've never needed great journalists like we need them today. And so the work being done in our universities like Belmont has never been more important.
Can I ask you a question about, since we're talking about careers in journalism, it's really a shifting landscape. Some of the traditional media outlets, of course, where our young graduates would have started a career, and newspapers and certain kinds of traditional media outlets are just not there. And then you've got a lot of freelance work that's going on out there. How do you chart a path through a journalistic career now?
Yeah, no, they're in smaller communities, newspapers are often really drying up in terms of the economic model for newspapers. We know that across the country, there are areas that we call news deserts, where audiences are not able to reach, the media is not able to reach audiences with any high quality journalism. We've been investing in creating a hub system with our member stations. We have 264 member stations across the country, one in Murfreesboro, one in Nashville, of course, and Knoxville, as you remember. And what we're doing is we're pulling together in these news deserts in places like rural Texas and the Gulf Coast and rural Midwest. We're pulling stations together to form a hub where they share journalists, share editors, share content, so that we can help create a fertile ground for a rich and excellent journalism in parts of the country that have nowhere to go. And those are creating interesting opportunities. I also think we have to be very attentive to making sure we're supporting and paying interns, particularly creating a more diverse intern program, so that we're bringing diversity as our top priority at the front end in developing young journalists, because it's never been more important as well that our journalists represent what America is, a wonderful mosaic of diversity, and we are working very hard to fulfill that goal going forward.
All right, the next question is William from Williamson County. John, you've been in journalism and the media industry for your entire career. Is there a situation that you can share with us where, in hindsight, you wished you'd handled things differently from an integrity standpoint? Of course, hindsight's worth a lot in these situations, right?
Right on. One that comes to mind is coverage of minority communities. When I was a news director in Chicago in the early 90s at the CBS station, we decided to go out into the community without cameras and just hold town halls and ask the citizens of Chicago, how we're doing as a news organization. And I'll never forget one in a town hall in South Chicago. It was a Black neighborhood, about 20, 25 citizens there. And this one lady stood and said, why is it you only show Black men when there's a crime committed or they're a sports or an athlete? Where are the Black doctors, the Black psychologists, the Black teachers, the Black professors? They don't seem to show up in your news stories as sources or as representation of the entire Black community. And I remember, I just said, you're right. That is absolutely right. And so when we got back to the newsroom, we instituted a whole new system for sourcing. We were using the same sources over and over out of an old Rolodex, and invariably our experts on various stories were white and male, and our victims were persons of color. And so we intentionally rebuilt our sourcing system so that we are sourcing persons of color in professional situations to help inform Chicago on key issues. So that was a real growth moment for me, for sure.
Mhm. I'm going to flip William's question and ask you the opposite. And can you think of a time when you stood by your guns and in light of, maybe an unpopular decision or something that was really tough, but in the end, you knew that you had made the right decision for yourself and for the organization?
Yeah, one comes to mind when there was a doctor in Minneapolis who knew he had HIV, but continued to perform invasive OBGYN procedures on patients, female patients, without gloves. And our investigative unit discovered that through the Minnesota Medical Association disciplinary records, which we got a hold of. And we were going to go with the story when it was ready. And the MMA threatened that was embargoed information, not a public document, and we can't go forward with that story. And we did. And the doctor thankfully was more than disciplined. I forget exactly what happened, but he was no longer performing those invasive procedures. And we took the heat from the MMA because we believed the higher purpose that we had was that the Minneapolis deserved to know what was going on with this doctor.
Interesting. Okay. We've covered a lot of ground, and so we've got about 8 minutes or so. Just give us your ending thoughts on this topic about where we sit as a country now and how we move forward, specifically from your position at MNPR, but how we move forward as a society around this.
Well, thank you. And thank you for this time with you, Sarah. This has been a really wonderful conversation. And thanks to those that submitted questions as well. Those were really great questions. I come back to the fact that we're all in this together, that the only reason we exist is to support you, our audiences, so that you have what you need to have what you want in terms of the government and the policies you support and the information you need in order to support that. And tell us when we're wrong, call us on it. We want to know if we get something wrong, but please don't bundle all media into the worst media that's out there. There's such a thing, just like anything in life, there's good and there's bad and there's ugly. And that's true with the media as well. And it's not impossible to really work a little to understand where the high quality media that you believe in is. It's also not a heavy lift to figure out what media has an agenda, and therefore their agenda is to make sure that you don't have all the facts. That's not hard to do. So again, we're in this together. Our country has never needed great journalism more than it does right now. I really believe that. In fact, I really believe that at this moment, it's a matter of life and death during this pandemic. And I believe in the power of truth. I think we need to talk more about truth telling and call out when it's being manipulated and stand up for it. That's my closing thought.
Thank you. Boyd, I don't know if you have any final words at this point, but I just want to, thank you on behalf of Belmont, on behalf of our students and those that are participating in this call. It is so valuable to have your perspective on what's going on, and especially at this time on our campus where, we just had a presidential debate here last week, and we're in the thick of these conversations that are so key to our country right now. And, as a university that really wants to support these students as they move forward, not just to success, but to purpose in their lives and in their careers, having persons like yourself who can come in and bring the example of their experience and expertise is just invaluable for us. And so we're very grateful.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Both. We really appreciate your time today. There were a number of questions we could not get to. We will try to follow up with the people who submitted those and be back in touch in the coming days. But John, thank you so much for spending part of your day. Sarah, we really appreciate your leadership and being the questioner of the professional journalist here. You both did a wonderful job. We thank you so much and appreciate everyone's support of the Edward C. Kennedy Center for Business Ethics. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you, Boyd.
Thank you all. Bye-bye.